Well, good morning. Good morning and welcome to day number 3. How are we back there with our camera? We're okay? All right. You all know who I am, John Vennari, editor of Catholic Family News, and I'll just go right into the first talk of the day. The title of this presentation is Our Lady of Fatima versus the Desire to Destroy Our Traditional Catholic Heritage. And it's going to be based on a recently released book on today's crisis of faith by a formidable Catholic writer named Mr. Atila Sinke Guimaraes. He originally lived in Brazil, but he's now living and publishing in the United States. He writes for the Catholic Family News. You'll see his articles in the Remnant. But anyway, the book's 502 pages burst with quotations from progressivist theologians, paridi, and prelates who are and were the movers and the shakers of the Second Vatican Council and of the post-conciliar period. The book documents in a methodical and organized manner the one point on which all these progressivists converge, and that is their desire to advance a new theology that is different from the 2,000 years of Catholicism that preceded them. And in order for this new theology to triumph, the old theology has to be eliminated. So this means that the one characteristic shared by the progressivists is the desire to destroy traditional Catholicism. The teachings must change, the institutions must be reformed, the entire religion has to be restructured. And the landmark event that launched this massive restructuring was, of course, the Second Vatican Council. Now, the book that I'm talking about is entitled Animus Delindi 1, in English, The Desire to Destroy. It's volume 4. This is volume 4 of an 11-volume work entitled Eli, lama sabachthani, My God, why hast thou forsaken me? It's an 11-volume work on the Council and its tragic aftermath. It's the fruit of 15 years of labor, and it's unparalleled in anything that's been done before. Mr. Guimaraes utilizes 7 research languages. He works in 7 languages, and we receive a lot of quotations that we're getting in English for the first time. Now, many of you probably know that in 1997, Mr. Guimaraes published Volume 1 of this collection. It's entitled In the Murky Waters of Vatican II. And this first volume demonstrates, Murky Waters of Vatican II, demonstrates that the documents of the Second Vatican Council are a quagmire of imprecisions and ambiguities. And these ambiguities are not due to an honest mishap, but to a calculated plan, a definite strategy, which is to advance a new theology that runs contrary to Catholic teaching in its orientation. As a result, the Vatican II documents contain within themselves 2 opposing currents. There is the progressivist current and the traditional Catholic current, often in the same document, sometimes in the same paragraph, sometimes in the same sentence. And the conservative passages of Vatican II serve as a camouflage for the Council's progressivist orientation. For example, we have the quote from Father Edward Schielebeck, a progressivist theologian at the Council who is one of the primary drafters of the Vatican II documents. He revealed their strategy. He said, and he was one of the primary drafters, he said, we have used ambiguous terms in the Council documents, and we know how we will interpret them afterwards. So this means then that the texts of Vatican II are actually flawed documents that have provided the so-called justification for a revolution in the Church from top to bottom. Now, before we go any further, I think we need to establish what is the status of Vatican II documents. Why are we free to critique them or ask questions about them? Well, this was. I'm trying to find the quotation in here. Vatican II was a pastoral council, not a dogmatic council. And the fact that Vatican II is inferior to a dogmatic council there was testimony from Bishop Thomas Morris, this was testimony which at his request was not unsealed until after his death. He was a council father. He said, "I was relieved when we were told that this council was not aiming at defining or giving final statements on doctrine, because a statement on doctrine has to be very carefully formulated, and I would have regarded the council documents as tentative and liable to be reformed." At the close of Vatican II, the bishops asked the council secretary, Archbishop Pericchio Felici, who later became a cardinal, they asked for what theologians call the theological weight of Vatican II documents. What is their status? What is their weight? Here's how the Secretary General of the Council responded, quote, "We have to distinguish according to the schemas and the chapters those which have already been the subject of dogmatic definitions in the past. As for the declarations which have a novel character, we have to make reservations." Close quote. At the close of Vatican II, Pope Paul VI gave this explanation. I'll read the whole thing. "There are those who ask what authority, what theological qualification the Council intended to give to its teachings, knowing that it avoided using solemn dogmatic definitions engaging the infallibility of the ecclesiastical magisterium." This is Paul VI speaking. "The answer is known by whoever remembers the conciliar declaration of March 6, 1964, repeated on November 16, 1964. Given the Council's pastoral character, it avoided pronouncing in an extraordinary manner dogmas endowed with the note of infallibility." Close quote. So, in other words, unlike a dogmatic council, Vatican II does not demand an unqualified assent of faith. Vatican II's verbose and ambiguous pronouncements are not on a par with dogmatic pronouncements, and Catholics may make reservations and even resist those points from the council that would conflict with the perennial magisterium, such as ecumenism, such as the Declaration on Religious Liberty. We could go right down the line. Now, in Volume 1, this book here, by the way, we have a lot of these. I would suggest if you don't have them, take one home. They're $10. In Volume 1, the author cites thousands of statements from progressivists who reveal their avowed aim to remake the Church into their own modernist likeness. I'll give you a little more about Volume 1 before we go into Volume 4. See, Murky Waters takes an approach that is different from a book like Iota Unum by Romano Amerio. In the book Iota Unum, Romano Amerio, who had been a council peritus, he spotlights various errors and then he gives the refutation, especially through expert use of the perennial philosophy, for Thomistic philosophy. And the approach also differs from a book such as Michael Davies' Second Vatican Council on Religious Liberty, which demonstrates that certain tenets of Vatican II are in conflict with prior magisterium. Guimaraes' Murky Waters starts with the Vatican II documents themselves. He writes, quote, if someone gifted with average intelligence and culture, moved by his love of the Church, were to read the documents of Vatican II, his mind would gradually be filled with questions as he progressed in his study. Close quote. He explains that the reader will encounter certain statements in Vatican II that seem to be unnecessarily imprecise and unclear. For example, the council document Lumen Gentium says that the Church of Christ subsists in the Catholic Church. Now, this causes bewilderment. Why doesn't the document clearly proclaim what Pope Pius XII said, that the Church of Christ is the Catholic Church? It exists exclusively in the Catholic Church. Why employ a term that's favorable to the progressivist error that the Church of Christ is actually bigger than the Catholic Church, with other Protestant denominations that are somehow, in some mysterious way, as we're told, are somehow part of them? Now, this is the basic interpretation of this word. That's why it was used. Father Schmidberger says he has a letter that admits that they asked a Protestant theologian to give them the word, and he was the one that suggested use the word subsists, because this will encompass Protestant churches as well into the Church of Christ. Avery Dulles, who was just made a cardinal, he said in 1974, quote, the Church of Christ is not exclusively identical with the Roman Catholic Church. It does indeed subsist in Roman Catholicism, but it is also present in varying modes and degrees in other Christian communities, to the extent that they too are what God initiated in Jesus and are obedient to the inspirations of Christ's Spirit. Well, that's a ludicrous statement. I mean, if they were obedient to Christ's Spirit, they would become Catholic. But in any event, so this is the confusion that these ambiguities cause, and it also has good people fighting amongst themselves. There are people who say, well, subsist is a better term. They haven't read, of course, what the progressivists said, that they use that term in order to incorporate non-Catholics into the Church of Christ, which is contrary to 2,000 years of church teaching, that there's no salvation outside the Catholic Church. Anyway, Guimaraes examines the council text in the light of the open admissions from those who drafted the documents and from other conciliar quote-unquote experts, Karl Rahner, Yves Congar, Hans Kung, Edward Schielebeck, Henri de Lubac, Cardinal Sunens, Cardinal Koenig, Dominic Chenu, and the book is a goldmine of citations. With countless documented quotations, I'll tell you what the author demonstrates in the first book. It's basically a 6-point framework that this book shows. First, that the ambiguities in the council documents exist. He just gives you the evidence. They do exist. Second, that these ambiguities are not due to an honest mishap, but to a calculated plan, a definite strategy, a strategy that mirrors the strategy of the modernists in the turn of the century, who used deliberate imprecision in order to sneak in their new ideas. Point number 3, that the ambiguities serve to advance a new theology that's contrary to traditional Catholic theology, so that there are actually two currents, two ideologies at work in the documents themselves. As I said, a progressivist current and a traditional current. Fourth, that the ambiguities of Vatican II serve to silence the conservative critics and to calm conservative fears, since in these duplicitous documents the traditional position can often be cited. As you see, like in the document on the liturgical reform, it says the Gregorian chant is supposed to be cultivated. But it didn't happen, but it's in the document. Point number 5, that the ambiguities have opened the door to endless change for the future. And as long as the Council's plan is followed, the Church will be in a never-ending process of reforming and adapting and reforming and adapting and reforming and adapting. It's what the new documents call continuous aggiornamento. And sixthly, that the effect of these ambiguous documents has led to multiple concessions with false ideas and false religions that has caused a great crisis of faith, morals, and discipline among clergy, religious, and laity. So the first volume really does a great service in documenting the progressivist motives of those who wielded the greatest influence on the Council and of those who perpetuate the spirit of Vatican II to this day. Now, Guimaraes' latest release, Volume 4, it examines another aspect of this revolution within a very strict framework. It documents extensively the progressivist, what he calls the desire to destroy the 2,000 years of Catholic teaching that preceded Vatican II in order to replace it with a new, ever-evolving religion, which they still call Catholicism. Quotations from avant-garde luminaries such as Karl Rahner, Hans Kung, Hans Urs von Balthasar, Henri de Lubac, Dominic Chenu, Yves Congar make it very clear that the old religion, or at least parts of it, had to be wiped out in order for the new springtime of the new council to succeed. So this means then that the destruction and confusion that followed the council is not something that they necessarily find appalling. In fact, within varying degrees among the progressivists, they recognize the destruction that followed the council as good and necessary, so to get the old church out of the way so that the new religion may grow and prosper. In 1972, there was a famous quote, Pope Paul VI. He spoke of the auto-demolition of the church. In other words, the church is in a state of self-destruction. Yet, we realize, too, at the same time, he didn't do anything to stop it. And Mr. Guimaraes asks the question, was he condemning this auto-demolition, or was it just a futile lament? Was it a demolition that even he thought was tragic but necessary? Because it has to be pointed out, the same Pope Paul VI, he employed the argument of tragic but necessary in order to annihilate Latin, the old Latin Mass, and to replace it with a banal vernacular version. In 1969, regarding the institution of the so-called New Rite of Mass, or as Richard Calvin Guido calls it, the Bunini Mass, Pope Paul VI was half lamenting, half rejoicing when he said, quote, this is Paul VI speaking, "It is here that the greatest newness is going to be noticed, the newness of language. No longer Latin, but the spoken language will be the principal language of the Mass. The introduction of the vernacular will certainly be a great sacrifice for those who know the beauty, the power, and the expressive sacrality of Latin. We are parting with the speech of the Christian centuries. We are becoming like profane intruders in the literary preserve of sacred utterance. We will lose a great part of that stupendous and incomparable artistic and spiritual thing, the Gregorian chant." Now, wait a minute. Didn't I just say that Vatican II said we're supposed to preserve Gregorian chant? Now Paul VI saying, well, we're going to lose it. It's too bad. We have reason for regret, reason almost for bewilderment. What can we put in the place of that language of the angels? We are giving up something of priceless worth. Why? What is more precious than these loftiest of the Church's values? What is more precious? Appealing to modern man. A modern man who is so enlightened that the Church has to change its centuries-old teaching in order to accommodate him, and a modern man who's so dim-witted that he can't handle Latin in the liturgy, even when the vernacular translations appears right next to it in his missal. See, in any event, Paul VI continued. He says, "The answer will seem banal, almost prosaic, yet it is good because it is human. It is apostolic. Understanding of prayer is more important than the silken garments in which it is royally dressed. Participation by the people is worth more, particularly participation by modern people, so fond of plain language, which is easily understood and converted into everyday speech." Close quote. That's Paul VI's apologia for destroying Latin in the liturgy. We can see, with all due respect, he was an apostle of banality. And it's one of the darkest moments in church history. Paul VI's speech is a metaphor for what has happened to the entire church since the council. The orientation of Vatican II is the work of profane intruders who labor to destroy something of priceless worth, that is the beauty, the truth, and the immutability of Catholic teaching. It is no accident that Vatican II caused unprecedented destruction, because the Council's prime movers were planning destruction all along. And in Volume 4, again, I hold up the book. We only have 5 copies of this, so make sure you get one or order one if they run out. In Volume 4, Guimaraes has performed a mammoth task in presenting literally hundreds of quotations from the so-called leading lights of the Council and the post-conciliar period. Their own words reveal their desire to destroy. And this malevolent desire, however, has now been christened with a more benevolent name. It is now called the Spirit of Vatican II. This book, as I said, is a demonstration of the modernist thinking that is at the heart of the Vatican II revolution. Guimaraes quotes progressivist clergymen such as Cardinal Sunens, Hans Kung, Louis Boyer, Yves Congar. They celebrate Vatican II as a revolution, in their own words. They celebrate it as the death of one era and the beginning of another. Cardinal Sunens, who wielded great influence over Paul VI, and who was a darling of those who call themselves Catholic charismatics. That's another oxymoron. Sunens rejoiced that Vatican II marked the end of the Tridentine epoch and the end of the era of Vatican I. You can find that on page 60 of Guimaraes' book. Elsewhere, Cardinal Sunens exclaimed with joy, he said, "Vatican II is the French Revolution of the Church." Hans Kung, the liberal Paridi Hans Kung, he gloated. He said, quote, "Compared to the post-Tridentine epoch of the Counter-Reformation, Vatican II represents in its fundamental characteristics a 180-degree turn. It is a new church that has sprung up since Vatican II." Close quote. One of the most, you might be interested, I learned from reading Guimaraes' book, one of the things that Hans Kung, one of the areas in which he was most active during the council is he was a speechwriter for bishops. So when the bishops got up to make their interventions, it was actually the thought process of Hans Kung coming out of their mouths. Likewise, Father Louis Bourrier, a French Peritist at the council, he exclaimed with relish that the anti-Protestant and anti-modernist aspect of the Catholic Church, he said, it might as well die. Likewise, the Rome-based Jesuit magazine La Civile Cattolica exclaimed jubilantly, it said, quote, with Vatican II, the Tridentine age was brought to a close for the Church. That's on page 62 of Guimaraes' book. Now, these statements are especially audacious when we consider that the Councils of Trent and Vatican I are dogmatic councils whose teachings can never change, never be disregarded, never be reinterpreted, especially in the name of what we hear today as a deeper understanding. No, the First Vatican Council declared infallibly, quote, the meaning of sacred dogma, which must always be preserved, is that which our Holy Mother Church has determined. Never is it permissible to depart from this in the name of a deeper understanding, close quote. We are told that dogmas can't change. Modernism, however, as Pope St. Pius X warned, do not accept anything as fixed or unchangeable. The chief principle is the evolution of dogma. They champion the notion that religion must change for the sake of changing times. And in this respect, as in many others, the prime movers of Vatican II reveal themselves as men who are steeped in the error of modernism. What better description of what happened to the Church and those who promulgate it can there be than Pius X's warning in 1907 when he said of the modernists, there is no part of Catholic truth that they leave untouched, none that they do not strive to corrupt. Close quote. So Mr. Guimaraes delivers extensive documentation, citing one audacious statement after another from influential progressivists who claim that it is now time for the Church to abandon the teaching of the Church as the perfect society, to discard scholasticism. I've run into that myself through my own research. To overturn the monarchical structure of the Church, cast aside papal infallibility, reject the notion that Catholic truth is unchangeable, restructure the papacy according to ecumenical lines, propound, this is really strange, propound this grotesque theory of kenosis, which falsely claims that the Church has to practice self-annihilation in order to be more Christ-like. It's a bizarre theory. It takes up chapter 3 of this book. It's time for the Church to renounce the militant aspect of the Church in favor of dialogue and peaceful coexistence with false religions. It encourages the self-destruction of the Church in her holy, sacral, and Roman nature. It advocates a Pentecostal church of powerful laymen. I've met some of them. It admits the Church. It says it's time for the Church to admit its sinfulness and to offer copious apologies for past sins. It's time for the Church to despoil itself of its wealth, to disregard Pius IX's syllabus of errors, to promote the modernist notion that faith emanates from the people of God, to forsake the Church's claim to be the one true Church established by our Lord, outside of which there is no salvation. And this is just a sampling of what these men want to overturn. And even more disturbing is the fact that the progressivists who promote these views have formed almost 2 generations of Catholic laity and clergy. The works of Rahner, Kung, Schielebeck, Congar, de Lubac, von Balthasar, and their disciples, these works now dominate the teaching texts of Catholic seminaries and Catholic universities. For the past 35 years, the progressivist tenets of these men, whom I've just mentioned, have served as the principal formation for priests, theologians, and Catholic college students. This means that we have now reached a stage, especially in the Western world, where the average bishop will regard Karl Rahner as a greater authority than St. Robert Bellarmine. In this way, that for all practical purposes, these prelates will not base their acceptance on Rahner's theology on whether or not it squares with St. Robert Bellarmine. Rather, they will do the opposite. They will only accept the teaching of Bellarmine depending upon the spin given it by Karl Rahner. And if Karl Rahner and those like him say that Bellarmine's teachings are now passé, for example, the teaching on the Church as the perfect society, these prelates, or many of them, will just nod in fatuous agreement. And all of this has occurred under the benevolent gaze, or as in the case of Henri de Lubac and von Balthasar, with the full throttle endorsement of the post-conciliar popes, who even before their elevation to the papacy were akin to the progressivist brotherhood. Before his elevation to the papacy, Pope Paul VI, then Cardinal Montini, was one of a clique of progressivist cardinals in Europe. He was a close friend and collaborator with Cardinal Sunens, which is one of the reasons why Cardinal Sunens, throughout the pontificate of Paul VI, had a very strong influence on Paul VI. It was Cardinal Sunens pressuring Paul VI to give his blessing to the charismatics. That's how the charismatics got approval, quote unquote, in the church, because Sunens was pushing Pope Montini very hard, and Montini gave in. Likewise, there is a conservative Catholic writer, and this is only one of them, I'm just quoting one for time's sake, but there is a conservative Catholic writer. He writes in praise of Pope John Paul II, quote, Bishop Wojtyla took a progressive stand at Vatican II, and he interacted with the progressivist theologians at the council. That's found on page 98 of Pope John Paul II, A Festive Profile. That both Paul and John Paul II were always part of that progressivist group. Now, a key section of the book which deserves special mention is chapter 3, where Mr. Guimaraes reveals the mechanics of revolution and how it applies to Vatican II. See, this is a very interesting section because he points out there are two types of revolutionaries whose work harmonize with each other. The first are the hotheads, or in Italian, the arditi, the militant extremists. And the second are the moderates, those who appear innocuous because they advance the revolution at a much more slower pace. Now, the arditi, the hotheads, they charge ahead, even somewhat recklessly, way ahead of the pack, and they plant the standard that indicates the goals that they want the revolution to achieve. And because they appear to be so radical, so shocking, these hotheads will immediately be condemned, even by sometimes the moderates, who, while sympathizing with many of the views, they regret that these men have gone a little too far. Yet in time, the moderate revolutionaries, traveling at a slow speed, eventually accomplish the original goals of the hothead radicals. And in time, the former hotheads even come to be revered as prophets who foretold the future and who suffered persecution in their time, and they were completely misunderstood in their own day. Now, this is the dynamic. He points it out in detail in the book. This is the dynamic that played itself out in the French Revolution, in the apparent struggle between socialism and communism, and it's also what we see within Vatican II. See, radical extremists such as Yves Congar, de Lubac, Chenu, Rahner, Ratzinger had either been condemned or under theological suspicion before the council. These same men, without ever changing their positions, gave the decisive orientation to Vatican II and are now hailed as the new luminaries. Many of their formerly condemned positions, such as ecumenism, which was condemned, the type of ecumenism that's practiced today, was condemned explicitly by Pope Pius XI in his 1928 encyclical Mortalium Animus. These extreme positions of the 1920s and 30s are now considered mainstream Catholicism. And some of the men who promoted these views are even given cardinals' hats. Now, there's a specific example of this revolutionary dynamic is provided in Chapter 3 of Guimaraes' book, which contains a fascinating comparative study of two revolutionaries, Father Dominic Chenu, which is a revolutionary of the past, and Father Hans Kung, whom we all know and love. Chenu was a pre-Vatican II arditi that is now considered conservative. And Kung represents the post-Vatican II arditi, the most leftist of the left. Now, these two clergymen share a common scar. They were both censored by the Vatican because of their heretical views. Dominic Chenu, Dominican, was censored in 1942, and Hans Kung censored in 1976 and 1979. And the study of these two men provide two primary lessons. First, it is an example of how yesterday's heresies have mysteriously become today's orthodoxy. And second, it explains why today's radical theologians do not take Vatican condemnation seriously, since the recent history has shown that if the most leftist theologians just sticks to his guns, he may even rejoice in time to see his formerly condemned views emerge as mainstream Catholicism. This is a definite case history here. First, Dominic Chenu. Who's hearing that name for the first time? Dominic Chenu. He's not very well known, but he was influential, believe me. Dominic Chenu was an advocate of what was called the New Theology. It was made famous by Henri de Lubac. It was a problem, especially in the 40s and the 50s. Chenu was condemned in 1942 by Pope Pius XII. His book, Ini Ecole di Theologie, was placed on the index of forbidden books, and he lost his rectorship at the Dominican College. Now, I've done, independent from Guimaraes' work, I've done my own research in the area of the New Theology. I'm going to give a talk on it in the Catholic Family News Conference in April. It really explains exactly what happened since the Council, understanding this New Theology. But Father David Greenstock, a superb Thomistic theologian, writing in the 1950 issue of a theological journal called The Thomist, he wrote against the New Theology of Chenu and de Lubac, and he explained the dangers of their system and the reason that they needed to be condemned, and it was right for them to be condemned. Greenstock pointed out that the partisans of the New Theology reject the Aristotelio-Thomistic philosophy in favor of modern philosophies. The proponents of the New Theology do this, they claim, in order to appeal to modern man. We heard this already, to appeal to modern man, who finds Thomistic philosophy irrelevant, supposedly. It's very relevant, but anyway. The result is that Catholic theology, once you do this, Catholic theology is knocked from its firm philosophical foundations and shifted on to the fluid and weird philosophical systems of the 20th century. Most of these systems are founded on agnosticism and atheism. Agnosticism and atheism. Now, Dominic Chenu rejected the unchangeableness of Catholic doctrine. He claimed that the source of all theology is not immutable dogma, but rather the vital life of the Church in its members, which cannot be separated from history. This means, strictly speaking, that Greenstock explains, that Chenu held that theology is the life of the members of the Church rather than the series of conclusions drawn from revealed data with the age of reason. So what this means, basically, is that theology is not to be drawn from unchangeable doctrine outside of us, but from the vital life of members of the Church that changes from age to age. Now, if that's not modernism, I don't know what is. So as a result, it follows that Chenu held that religion can change with the times and should change with the times according to the demands of circumstances. And Greenstock explained that the partisans of this new theology are both unorthodox and deliberately deceitful. The main contention of the partisans of this movement, I'm quoting Greenstock now, is that theology to remain alive must move with the times. 1950, he's writing this now. At the same time, these men are very, very careful to repeat all the fundamental propositions of traditional theology, almost as if there was no intention of any attack against it. This is very true of such writers as Father de Lubac, Father Delanoux, Karl Rahner, all of whom undoubtedly are at the very center of this movement. Close quote. Likewise, in a public discourse on December 19, 1946, it was published in the Observatorio Romano, Pope Pius XII targeted the heterodox theories of Chenu and de Lubac and warned against the new theology as something that undermines the Catholic faith. Here's what he said, quote, "There is a good deal of talk, but without necessary clarity of concept, about a new theology which must be in constant transformation, following the examples of all other things in the world, which are in a constant state of flux and movement without ever reaching their term. If we were to accept such an opinion, what would become of the unchangeable dogmas of the Catholic faith? And what would become of the unity and stability of that faith? Well, that's a rhetorical question. By asking it, he's answering it. There will be no stability. There will be no unchangeable dogmas. Likewise, the eminent Dominican theologian, Father Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, he wrote a landmark essay on this problem. It was called "Where is the New Theology Taking Us?" It was published in France at the Angelicum. We published it, and we got it translated for Catholic Family News. I wish I would have brought copies with me. But anyway, Father Garrigou-Lagrange demonstrates that the purveyors of the new theology, Maurice Blondel, Henri de Lubac, Dominic Chenu, he says, and this is a quote for him, they pervert entirely the concept of the immutability of truth. In other words, the unchangeableness of truth. And he warned, the new theology can only lead in one downward direction. Garrigou-Lagrange says it leads straight back to modernism. So, interesting. While all this was going on, Father Dominic Chenu, Father Henri de Lubac were receiving behind-the-scenes protection and encouragement from Cardinal Suard, who was the Archbishop of Paris. Suard told Dominic Chenu, he said, don't worry, he said, because in 20 years, everyone in the church will be talking like you. He said that in the 1940s, all right? In the early 60s, Father Dominic Chenu was one of many radical theologians who were invited to Vatican II by Pope John XXIII. To my knowledge, I think Romano Amerio points this out, that this was actually breaking the council rules. Supposedly, it's just a kind of a point of common sense, any theologian that was theologically suspect should not be invited to a general council in order to be a theological advisor. But the rules were broken. The rules were broken time and time again in Vatican II. An interesting study could be done on that. But in any event, thanks to the Council's progressivist orientation, Father Chenu saw many of his formerly condemned theories. He saw these same theories advanced as part of Vatican II's new teaching, especially, Guimaraes points out, within the document Gaudium et Spes, the pastoral constitution of the Church in the modern world, which also Cardinal Ratzinger tells us, without necessarily complaining about it for some reason, he tells us that Teilhard de Chardin had tremendous influence. The thought process of Teilhard de Chardin had tremendous influence on Gaudium et Spes. But anyway, Chenu relates joyfully that the very points for which he was condemned in 1942 are the same exact points now being promoted by members of the hierarchy in the name of the council. See, yesterday's heresies have become today's orthodoxy. So that's part one, Chenu. Then the book spotlights a present-day hothead, Arditi. It spotlights the 1976 and 1979 condemnations of Hans Kung, another so-called leading light of the post-conciliar period. Now, Kung had worked closely at the council with other radicals such as Yves Congar, Joseph Ratzinger, Karl Rahner, Edward Schielebeck, and in the 1970s, because Kung had gone too far, he was censored by the Vatican for certain heretical views, in which Kung rejects papal infallibility. He teaches that bishops do not receive their authority from Christ. He propounds that any baptized person has the power to consecrate the Eucharist, and he denies that Christ is consubstantial with the Father, and he undermines doctrines concerning the Blessed Virgin Mary. Now, it needs to be pointed out that these are only some of Hans Kung's heretical views, but they were the only ones mentioned specifically within the Vatican sanctions. Thus, in effect, the Vatican left Kung's other heterodox tenets untouched. For example, on one of his most famous books, on being a Christian, he tells us everything that a Christian is not. But anyway, on being a Christian, Hans Kung denies the divinity of Christ. He dismisses the miracles of the Gospels. He denies the bodily resurrection of Jesus. He denies that Christ founded an institutional church. He denies that the Mass is the representation of Calvary. Kung has never retracted these unorthodox statements. Moreover, Kung has publicly called for a revision of church teaching on issues such as papal infallibility, birth control, mandatory celibacy of priests, and women in the priesthood. And despite this blatant rejection of church teaching, and believe me, he's very influential, the only penalty that the Vatican has inflicted against Kung was that he is not allowed to be considered as a Catholic theologian. And as such, he was not allowed to teach theology in a Catholic university. Whoop-de-doo. The Vatican, however, never condemned Kung as a heretic, never excommunicated him as canon law approves, never ordered that his books be removed from libraries and Catholic seminaries and universities where they are found in abundance, never prevented him from being a guest lecturer at Catholic institutions, never obstructed him from publishing articles in Concilium or any other progressivist Catholic publications. Father Hans Kung is not even suspended. To this day, he remains a priest in good standing in the Diocese of Basel, as Chris Ferrara pointed out the other day, with no other canonical penalties leveled against him. This means that this priest, who continues to vomit out his heretical poison upon anyone within reach, is still allowed to conduct public liturgy, to preach, and to give advice in the confessional. The Vatican's congregation of the clergy, under Cardinal Hoyos, leaves him untouched. The University of Tübingen, Kung's home campus, retained Kung as a teaching professor. What they did is they just restructured the university so that Kung, who's a veritable celebrity, can continue teaching in that part of the university that is now chartered as a secular school. They just reshuffled some papers, and he was no longer in the Catholic part, he was in the secular part. So despite the feeble Vatican condemnation, Kung retains access to a wide variety of influential pipelines to disseminate his poisonous doctrine throughout the church. In fact, too, it is said, I think Jerry Matitix can tell this story, it's said that Hans Kung's so-called theological breakthroughs on the nature of the church are what provided the so-called theological foundation that made possible the 1999 Lutheran Catholic Accord. And also, Hans Kung is one of those progressivist theologians who were calling for the church to apologize for its past sins. Further, in 1998, Vatican Secretary of State Cardinal Sodano, the most powerful cardinal in the church, praised Kung in a public speech in Rome, where he praised Kung for, quote, beautiful pages dedicated to the Christian mystery, close quote. Cardinal Sodano also referred to Hans Kung as a theologian, even though Hans Kung supposedly has been stripped of this title. And this, of course, is the same Cardinal Angelo Sodano who is ultimately behind the present persecution of Father Nicholas Gruner, as Chris Ferrara explains so well. But here's the real point. The 1942 condemnations that the Vatican leveled against Chenu were far more severe than what is presently hurled at Kung. Yet Chenu not only survived, but became a leading light of the conciliar church without ever changing his erroneous views. The same is true of Karl Rahner, Congar, Bach, von Balthasar, John Courtney Mary, all of whom were theologically suspect before the council and now enjoy great prestige and praise, even though they never abandoned their liberal principles. Hans Kung and those like him then have reason to fill their breast with hope, have reason to believe that the present condemnation he suffers is just a temporary inconvenience, an annoying setback, a fate meted out to all true prophets. And just as Chenu saw his heretical views eventually win the day thanks to a revolutionary council, so likewise Hans Kung can fill his breast with hope, as I said, that his erroneous views, perhaps in the not-so-distant future, will eventually emerge as mainstream Catholicism. You might think that's crazy or impossible. Anyone who does, I think we need to ponder what is now considered as mainstream Catholicism, thanks to the reforms of the Second Vatican Council. Imagine if you could go back into time and you could meet a Catholic walking the streets in 1950, and you would say to him, in 50 years, communion in the hand will be common practice in the church. He would say, unthinkable. There will be lay Eucharistic ministers giving out communion in little pastel pantsuits. Impossible. There will be altar girls up on the altar. What are you, nuts? There will be a religious liberty that claims that pagans and heretics have a right to publicly practice their false religions. You must be from another planet. There will be pan-religious prayer meetings with Catholics praying in public with Protestants, Jews, Muslims, snake worshippers. And instead of labeling this as a sin against the first commandment, it's going to be given the name the Spirit of Assisi. The Catholic would say this could never happen. The Latin Tridentine Mass, you tell them, will be eclipsed by a new liturgy constructed upon Protestant principles. Absolutely not. We will have a pope who kisses the Koran. Never. We will have enculturated liturgies such as Hawaiian hula masses, Polish polka masses, Vietnamese dragon masses. This is preposterous. We will have a veritable rejection of the thrice-defined dogma that outside the church there is no salvation. That could never happen. This dogma, it can't be changed. We will have the announcement of a common martyrology that includes Catholics, non-Catholics, Protestants, you name it. No way. We will have Catholics asking Protestant Pentecostals to lay hands on them and then claiming to be filling to overflowing with the Spirit and babbling and shrieking in tongues. He would say, now I know you're joking. We will have Catholic charismatics babbling in tongues and dancing to rock and roll music during Sunday Mass. He would say, oh, please. Yet every one of these above-mentioned aberrations and more are now common practice within the so-called Catholic Church, and traditional Catholics who complain about this are are just dismissed as disobedient and schismatic. See, the lesson is simple. It's a blind man can see it. And God forgive me, I'm starting to lose patience with those who can't. By suddenly blessing the working of previously condemned theologians who never corrected their heretical views, the pastoral, infallible Vatican II and the post-conciliar pontiffs have emboldened the most radical of leftists. And as long as our church leaders pledge first allegiance to Vatican II rather than the uninterrupted teaching of their predecessors, the darkness will increase. Given the precedent of Vatican II, nothing is unthinkable, anything is possible, even the eventual ambiguous blessing of some of Hans Kung's most heterodox tenets, perhaps due to, in time, a Third Vatican Council and the spirit of Vatican III. What these most leftist theologians have accomplished and what they now plan in the future are documented heavily in Mr. Guimaraes' latest book, The Desire to Destroy. And in my opinion, I don't think any Catholic could be afforded to be without this information, since the altar demolition continues unimpeded. And this is why I've stressed it repeatedly in the pages of Catholic Family News, the journal that I edit, that we are now only in the early stages of the Vatican II revolution. There are many more revolutionary changes to come, and it's not difficult to cite fresh examples. This past Jubilee year was heavily exploited to establish countless revolutionary precedents that bolster Vatican II's so-called continuous aggiornamento. And it really doesn't matter that now and then moderate revolutionaries such as Cardinal Ratzinger slow down the hotheads' forward march. The extreme liberals just laugh at Ratzinger's condemnations because Ratzinger himself is a left-wing beneficiary of the Council's upheaval. I have a lecture called The Church of Christ is One that demonstrates this. It's too much to go into right now. So, this destruction has happened because the vast program of aggiornamento runs contrary to Our Lady's message of Fatima. When Our Lady came to Fatima, she was not a revolutionary. She was faithful to tradition. The Fatima message is eminently trustworthy because it displays a profound reverence for the consistent and unchanging teaching of the Church. When Our Lady came to Fatima, she did not give us any new doctrine. She did not give us any new understanding of doctrine that would conflict in any way with the perennial magisterium. What do we see when she came to Fatima? We see the key doctrines of our faith reinforced, and also key doctrines that seem to have come under the most attack in our time. When Our Lady came to Fatima, she spoke of the doctrine of heaven. She spoke of the doctrine of hell. She showed the children hell. She spoke of the doctrine of purgatory. She spoke of the doctrine of the Holy Eucharist. She spoke of the doctrine of the sacrament of penance. And she also spoke indirectly of the social kingship of Jesus Christ. This is all implicit in the request to consecrate Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. She also spoke of the need for reparation of sin. When the angel came to Fatima and gave the children communion, he showed us the traditional means of giving reverence toward the sacrament. He prostrated himself before the sacrament, before the Blessed Sacrament, showing the adoration that we owe, that is due the most blessed, our Lord in the Blessed Eucharist. And also, of course, when he administered Holy Communion to Sister Lucia, he did not give her communion in the hand. Our Lady also asked for the third secret to be revealed in 1960. And as most of you know, Pope John the 23rd read the secret and decided not to release it. And just to make it very simple, he disobeyed Our Lady. Cardinal Oddi said publicly that it was his belief. He said this publicly. In fact, he asked the Fatima Crusader to publish this. He said publicly that he believed the third secret, and he was not alone in this, but he believed that the third secret really deals with the present crisis of faith, especially linked to the Second Vatican Council. This is why we were not given it. He said John the 23rd was a very buoyant and optimistic fellow. If the secret contained good news or something that would help the council, he would have released it. But he chose not to. He believes there were negative warnings of Vatican II. And by doing so, Pope John the 23rd closed the door on Our Lady, and the Church has been stricken with severe chaos ever since. And this is also because that around the same time, when our church leaders closed the door on Our Lady, from what I can see, they opened the door to someone else. One of the first liturgical changes after the council was what? It was the elimination of the St. Michael prayer to ward off the devil. Now, we all know Leo XIII had that vision, or he heard that locution of the devil saying he's going to destroy the church. And he wrote the St. Michael prayer, and he commanded that prayer be said after every low mass as a protection, as a barrier against the forces of hell. After the council, that barrier was taken away. And it's gotten to the point now, maybe some of you have read this, it's gotten to the point now where the chief exorcist in Rome, Father Gabriel Amarth, has publicly complained in an interview in 30 Days magazine and elsewhere that the new rite of exorcism doesn't work. And I don't like to read long quotations, but this is the chief exorcist in Rome, and he was complaining that this new rite that's been released, it doesn't work. I'm just going to read, I have things underlined, I'm just going to read through, I'm very much condensing what he says, but rather than me explain it, it's best just for this exorcist to speak for himself. He said, a rite that was so long awaited has turned out to be a joke, an incredible cord that is tying us in knots in our work against the devil. I can give you two blatant examples. At point 15, it talks of evil in the sense of the evil eye and how we should conduct ourselves. The evil eye is an evil eye directed at a person through the devil. This can be done in various ways, in the form of spells, curses, voodoo, and macumba. The Roman rite explains how this had to be addressed. The new rite, by contrast, categorically states that it is prohibited to perform exorcisms in these cases. Watch out for the Maloik. Huh? This evildoing is by far the most frequent cases of demonic possession and other evils procured by the devil, no fewer than 90%. It's like telling exorcists to retire. Then point 16 solemnly states that exorcisms must not be carried out unless the presence of the devil is ascertained. This is a masterpiece of incompetence, because we can only ascertain if the devil is possessing a person by performing an exorcism. And he goes on to say that someone who received an exorcism, it's never hurt anyone for someone to receive an exorcism that didn't need it. He says they are the fruits of ignorance and inexperience. 2 commissions worked on the rite: the commission of cardinals who edit the prenotanda, or the initial dispositions, and the commissions in charge of the prayers. I can say with certainty, he said, that no member of either commission has ever performed an exorcism or even witnessed one. No member has even the faintest idea of what an exorcism is. There lies the original sin in the rite. What happened is that we exorcists, he said, were never consulted. Furthermore, the suggestions that we gave were received with a certain irritation on the part of the commission. So you had exorcists saying, look, this is what we need, and the commission in the Vatican between coffee breaks are saying, oh, please, go away. We asked that the prayers be reviewed to include innovations to Our Lady. This request was completely that were lacking, and we asked for more specific prayers for exorcism, but we have been completely cut off. When we got to the practical part in our scrutiny, the part that requires specific expertise, it was blatantly obvious that the editors had no experience at all. We made copious observations, article by article, and we submitted them to all the parties concerned: the Congregation for Divine Worship, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and the Episcopal Conferences. A copy was also delivered to Pope John Paul II himself. The reception was very cool indeed, and their effect null. We found ourselves in front of a brick wall of rejection and scorn. The secretary for the Congregation for the Divine Worship said in a report to the Commission of Cardinals that their only interlocutions had been bishops, not priests or exorcists. They were also accused. One of these commissions sent around this report that there's been this orchestrated campaign, against it. And he says this is an indecent accusation. We were just trying to get, just trying for the right thing. The rite was designed for us, and yet no competent person has been invited to join the commission. Surely it was logical that we had a contribution to make. Their intention was to arm us with a blunt sword. Some effective prayers were canceled, prayers with 12 centuries of history, and new ineffective prayers were written in. Then there's this bizarre thing. He says that the congregation, the Congregation for Divine Worship, said that the exorcist may still use the old rite. But before he uses the old rite, he has to ask his bishop, and the bishop is ordered to ask the Congregation for Divine Worship, who they say will always grant permission. I mean, it's really strange. Anyway, he says we were very badly treated. That's the exorcist. Our fellow priests who are given this highly problematic task are now seen as crazed fanatics. In general, they are only tolerated by the very bishops who appointed them. He also tells the story of 150 exorcists going to Rome for a conference 5 years ago, and they were refused admission to a general audience of the Pope because they were exorcists. And he wrote asking for an explanation, and in this 30 Days magazine, he says, that was 5 years ago. I've still never received an explanation. The devil has managed to convince people that he does not exist. He has almost managed it even within the church. We have a clergy and an episcopate who no longer believe in the devil. That's quite a statement. We have a clergy and an episcopate who no longer believe in the devil, in exorcism, in the exceptional evil that the devil can instill. We have entire episcopates trying to counter exorcisms. We have countries completely devoid of exorcists, such as Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Spain, and Portugal. This is a shameful shortfall. So we can see the new rite of exorcism doesn't work. You might probably know also that in the new rite of baptism, the specific prayers of exorcism have been eliminated. He complains about that too. The fact that also a bishop in writing in the Fatima Crusader a couple of years ago complained of the same thing. You may also know that in the new rite of holy water that's been used for years now, the exorcism blessing has also been eliminated. Father Alfred Kunz, who was a canon lawyer, he was actually murdered a couple of years ago. But I was at a homeschool conference where he invited everyone to come because he was going to do the blessing of holy water. Now the diocese relied on him. He was a canon lawyer for the diocese, and he said to the people there, "I never use the new rite because the new rite contains no exorcism in the water. And if I use the new rite, I don't make holy water, I make happy water." He says, "I never use the new rite." So we have to ask the question: who stands to gain by this? Who stands to gain by the elimination of the St. Michael prayer that protects us from the devil? Who stands to gain by the exorcism in baptism that protects us from the devil? Who stands to gain in the elimination of the exorcism prayers in holy water that protects us from the devil? And who stands to gain by an exorcism rite that is ineffective in driving out the devils? Who stands to gain? The devil. And now I think we better understand the real warfare that we are in and why Sister Lucy complained of the diabolic disorientation of the upper hierarchy. And to bring this to a close, in the face of such diabolic disorientation, what do? We have to pray much, especially the Rosary, to learn and live the traditional doctrine and morals of the Catholic Church as found in pre-Vatican II Catholic writings, to adhere to the Latin Tridentine Mass where Catholic faith and devotion are found in their fullness, unaffected by today's modern trends, to resist with all one's soul, even publicly, the post-Vatican II trends that are wreaking such horror and confusion in the mystical body of Christ, as we were instructed to do by St. Robert Bellarmine, Juan de Torquemada, and John Cardinal Newman, as well as others, to instruct others charitably in the traditions of the faith and warn them of the errors of the times, to pray very hard, I know it would take a miracle, that a contagious return to sanity may sweep through a sufficient number of the hierarchy. And when it comes to the traditional doctrines of the Church, do not compromise, do not compromise, do not compromise. And on this point, St. Vincent of Lawrence have given us firm direction. Here's what he said. In a time of crisis, he's given us direction. He says, what should a Catholic do if some portion of the Church detaches itself from the communion of the universal faith? What other choice can he make if some new contagion attempts to poison no longer a small part of the Church, but the whole Church at once? Then his great concern will be to attach himself to antiquity, in other words, to tradition, which can no longer be led astray by any lying novelty. Thank you for your attention. I had mentioned that Father Joseph Ratzinger was part of the Progressivist Brotherhood. I detail this in a lecture called The Church of Christ is One. If anybody gets this tape, I'll give it. The two books mentioned in this lecture, In the Murky Waters of Vatican II and Animus Delindi, The Desire to Destroy, Book 1, as well as now, The Desire to Destroy Book 2. All three of these books are available for $20 each plus $2 postage from Oltyn Library Services, the address of which will follow. Extra copies of this recording may be obtained by writing to Oltyn Library Services, that's O-L-T-Y-N, Oltyn Library Services, 2316 Delaware Avenue, PMB 325, Buffalo, New York, 14216. Please ask for our catalog of traditional Catholic materials.